Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house to be so kind to make a courtesy check of your cell phones, that they have been silenced as we prepare to begin. It's always appreciated for those recording and posting the event online afterwards. Prior to my introduction of our host for today's program, we do have a brief video introduction to share with you, and then I will return and we will officially start the program. So we will now have our video. Thank you.
First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you, and then you win.
I'm here to represent the ordinary men and women of our country. Who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you.
Nigel Farage hopes David Cameron will one day eat his words.
We can govern ourselves, we can trade freely with the rest of Europe, we can control our own borders and make our own trade deals with the rest of the world.
We await the results of the European elections.
If we get what we like, things will never be quite the same again.
The UK Independence Party has managed to win over the hearts of the majority of the British public.
The People's Army of UKIP have spoken tonight.
What a tremendous surge in the vote.
I'm today leaving the Conservative Party and joining UKIP.
Today, I am leaving the Conservative Party.
I do hereby declare that the said Douglas Carswell is duly elected as a Member of Parliament.
I declare that Mark John Reckless has been elected as the Member of Parliament for the constituency of Rochester and Stroud.
The United Kingdom, the world's fifth largest economy, does not have the autonomy to determine trade policy.
We in this House today are discussing a policy explicitly designed to make energy more expensive.
Your presidency has been an unmitigated, unrivaled disaster.
If you've got the courage, you should lead the Greek people out of the Eurozone with your head held high. Get back your democracy, get back control of your country, give your people the leadership and the hope that they crave. Yes, it'll be tough for the first few months, but with a devalued currency and with friends of Greece all over the world, you will recover.
Thank you. As part of today's program, there will be question and answer sessions, but I do want to mention to everyone as we begin that following the sessions, all of the presenters will be available in our foyer during lunch for continued discussions with you. So if you don't happen to have a chance to ask the question here in-house, you can probably pigeonhole one of our guests out in the lobby and really put them on the spot. Hosting our special guest this morning and program and representing Heritage is Becky Norton Dunlop, Vice President for External Relations. She oversees our work in strategic outreach and communication, both nationally and internationally, to conservative policy institutions, other leadership organizations, and policy activists. Prior to joining us here, she served in the cabinet of Governor George Allen in the Commonwealth of Virginia. She had senior Reagan administration positions working in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel, as well as Special Assistant to the President for his Cabinet Affairs Office. She has also served Attorney General Edwin Meese at the Department of Justice and worked at the Department of Interior as Deputy Undersecretary of the Department for Interior, with her service as Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. She also is on numerous boards and other public policy associations here in D.C. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Becky Norton Dunlop.
Thank you so much, John. And on behalf of the Heritage Foundation, which, as many of you know, is the home of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, I want to welcome all of you who are our guests and our guests from across the pond. And I wonder if I could ask you to stand so that we can just welcome you officially and give you a hand. Well, I'm here today with the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for the day. And our keynote speaker, as you all know, because I'm sure that's one reason why you're here, is Nigel Farage. He is a founding member and current head of the United Kingdom Independence Party. He has been the head of UKIP since November 2010 and was most recently re-elected to the European Parliament as a representative for southeastern England. Under his leadership, UKIP in Great Britain garnered almost 4 million votes in the recent election. This was a 10% increase in its share of the votes since 2010. And I want to just say that comparatively, the Scottish National Party received 1,400,000 and some thousand votes, but got 50 seats in Parliament. The message here seems to me pretty clear. The UKIP voice in Great Britain is persuading a lot of British people of the rightness of their views, and perhaps the British electoral system needs some reform. Back to Nigel. As co-president of the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy group, Mr. Farage has been a staunch opponent of Eurozone currency integration, a vociferous advocate of British independence from the EU, and supports strong border controls for the UK. We spoke briefly this morning talking about an issue brief that the Heritage Foundation had produced regarding the 5 priority policy issues for Europe for 2015, and they included things like bring NATO back to the basics of collective security, promote genuine free trade. These are ideas that I think you'll hear some views from our speaker this morning, and so we're delighted to invite him to come to the podium to present our keynote address for today, the Honorable Nigel Farage.
Thank you. Well, Becky Heritage, thank you very much for inviting not just me, but a delegation of politicians from across Europe here today. And of course, I come from Europe, and as you will know, because Obama keeps telling you this, and the State Department keep telling you this, and in fact, too much of the American media keep telling you this, everything in Europe is going wonderfully well. There is absolutely nothing to worry about at all. The Eurozone is a fantastic success, and there are lots of American voices urging, and also American businesses, including Goldman Sachs. I'm sure there are 1 or 2 Goldman Sachs fans in the room. They, of course, were the people that cooked the books and earned a fortune to get Greece to qualify for being a Eurozone member. But we keep getting this message in Britain and in Europe that the Americans think everything's going swimmingly. And Obama keeps saying publicly that Greece must stay in the Euro. Oh, and of course, that Britain must stay inside the European Union. I thought what I'd do to begin with this morning is perhaps bring you up to date as to why that opinion may not quite be right. The very issue that got me into politics, and remember, I actually had a proper job before being in politics, which is pretty unusual these days, but I was a commodity broker and trader, and the issue that got me into politics was an evening back in 1990 when the Conservative government in Britain signed us up to the exchange rate mechanism. They effectively pegged sterling against the Deutschmark as a precursor to us joining what became the euro. And I was opposed to that, and I've been opposed to the European single currency project ever since. It was clear and utter madness to think that Germany and Greece could coexist together inside the same economic and monetary union. And there are some of us that have been making these arguments clearly for over 15 years. But the European project, which was being pushed in those days by Chancellor Kohl and by President Mitterrand, they had decided that what they were going to do was to build a United States of Europe. It was going to have a flag, an anthem, a president, who I thought I welcomed rather nicely on his first occasion in the Parliament, and it was going to become a new global superpower. And that superpower was necessary because America could not go unchallenged on the world stage. And whenever those people who were the architects of this were questioned about detail, were questioned about practicality, they just said, don't bother us with the details. They believed that if you put together an economic and monetary union, that overnight a political union would follow as night follows day. And of course it doesn't work, and the analysis that we all had 15 years ago has been right. The only way that Germany and Greece can coexist together inside the same economic and monetary union is if the Greeks become like the Germans, or the Germans become like the Greeks, and it ain't going to happen. The other point of the European project, apart from wanting to be a global superpower, was that it was designed to bring together the warring nations of Europe. And actually, if you think about it, the idea of getting the French and Germans round the table to share dinner and break bread in the 1950s was an entirely sensible thing to do. The idea that if people trade more with each other, they're less likely to fight each other was again an entirely sensible idea. Sadly, it's gone too far. And I now feel that this European project of love, cooperation and peace, well, just look at it. Just look at it. You know, Angela Merkel went to visit Athens last year to be greeted by people dressed up in Nazi uniforms. I mean, sort of, you look at it and think, do I laugh at this or do I want to cry at this? I mean, you just look at the language that was used in the European Parliament last week by German politicians about the Greeks. So actually, far from Europe coming together with a single currency, actually economically we're diverging, and far from the project bringing everyone together, what we're beginning to see is a return of the old enmities that have done Europe so much harm over the course of the last 100 years and more. The project isn't working. I grew up in a Europe that was divided from east to west by the Berlin Wall, and I'm now living in a Europe that is divided north to south by a new Berlin Wall, and that Berlin Wall is called the euro. Now, the Greeks had a referendum, you might have noticed, 2 weeks ago, and despite massive threats, despite being told that if they voted no, the power supply would fail, amongst other things, 61% of them said, we can't go on as we are. We can't take further austerity. And yes, it's easy for any of us to criticise the Greeks for their financial management and their retirement ages and everything else. But do think about this. You know, when the United States of America had its Great Depression, the sort of buddy, can you spare us a dime times, the US economy had contracted from top to bottom about 16%. The Greek economy has now contracted by 26% since 2008. And when we get the fresh figures for this current quarter, bearing in mind the banks have now been closed for almost 3 weeks, maybe that contraction will be closer to 30%. You know, we are watching a country that's in real trouble. If we have a heart and a soul, we will feel for the suffering of the Greek people. They never voted to join the euro. They were taken into it by Goldman Sachs and their own greedy politicians. We've got a situation in Greece where now the hospitals are actually running out of medicine. We're witnessing a political experiment that is taking a country, and we're watching it literally before our very eyes become a third world country. It is a human tragedy. And yet, in the face of that referendum, what has happened? What has happened is the big institutions of the EU, oh yes, and our friends from Washington. I hadn't yet touched on the International Monetary Fund, who now appear to have become an arm of European government. Just look at their last two leading figures. One, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, well, we'll perhaps gloss over that and move on. But Christine Lagarde, you know, a fully paid up member of the Eurocrat class, a fully paid up member of saying everything and anything must be done to maintain this project called the euro. So between the IMF and the European Commission and the European Council, what they have done is to bully Greece into signing up for a deal whose terms are even harsher than that was rejected by the Greek people in a referendum. You know, what price democracy, folks,
in modern day Europe. Well, it frankly doesn't exist. So that's the first big crisis that Europe faces, and it is perfectly clear to me that the only hope that countries like Greece have got is to find a leader with courage, and I'm sorry, Mr. Tsipras doesn't have much courage. You know, he's basically marched the Greek people up to the top of the hill, and then faced with the final big decision has marched them back down again. I am in no doubt that economic and monetary union will not last, that it will break up. The only question is, when will it break up, and just how bad will the social consequences be? I believe Greece going back to the drachma, having a big devaluation, allowing the banks to go bust. Yes, I know it's horrible. Depositors will lose money. But think, this is exactly what Iceland did. Little Iceland, a country of 250,000 people, faced that same banking crisis that America faced, that Britain faced, that much of the world, with the exception, of course, of Canada and Australia, who had sensible banking rules and didn't need bailouts. But when we all faced this, we bailed out the system, which in many ways was an odd concept within a capitalist country. But we bailed out the system. The Icelandics let the banks go bust. The Icelandics allowed their currency to sink. It fell by 80% on the world's exchanges. Inflation went to 30%. Interest rates went to 27%. There was then in 2010 a volcanic eruption, do you remember? And all the planes stopped flying. I mean, it looked like the Old Testament had come back, you know. I mean, it was pretty serious stuff, but now Iceland is back to growth. Now Iceland has just signed her own genuine free trade deal with China. That's the example we have to give to those Mediterranean countries, but to do that, we have to break the stranglehold of the European elites. And there's a second big problem and big dilemma that Europe is facing, and it's something that at the moment nobody has got the courage to own up to and to address. You will all have seen the photographs of the boatloads of migrants coming across the Mediterranean. It may be worth me mentioning that nearly every single one of those boats comes from a place called Libya. Weren't we clever getting rid of Colonel Gaddafi? Hasn't that worked out wonderfully? Anyway, Europe has decided that anybody that comes from a war-torn part of North Africa or the Middle East must be given the rights to settle. And I am not somebody that would ever want to turn our backs on the idea of giving refuge to people who genuinely are in fear of their lives. After all, I come from a country that, said yes to the French Huguenots. My family were French Huguenots, Protestants who were being burned at the stake. We said yes to the Jewish people who came first from Russia, and then, of course, who came from Germany and Austria, a country who said yes to the Ugandan Asians. So we're used to influxes of 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe even as high as 30,000 people seeking refugee status. But the problem, folks, is this. What we're facing coming across the Mediterranean is potentially a migration of genuinely Old Testament biblical proportions. We face potentially millions of people coming across, and that in itself brings a problem, but there's a bigger problem still, and that's this, that we have no means, we have no ability of checking criminal records or of checking political or religious associations of any of these people. And when IS say they will use this crisis to flood Europe with their own jihadists, I suspect we should believe them. And I think the whole debate on immigration, given that we now have an open door to people from Romania and Bulgaria, people whose minimum wages are 10 times lower than ours. The debate about immigration has been about money. It's been about the shape of communities, but the debate about immigration in Europe certainly is going to get onto the very key issue of security. So in the face of these two massive crises that Europe faces, we have a remarkable change in British politics. We have a Prime Minister who has always been committed to Britain's membership of the European Union. He believes that it's a very good thing. But because of the rise of UKIP, he was forced into making a promise that he never thought he'd have to deliver. The day before the election, you could have gone to Ladbrokes and you could have got 13-2 against a Conservative majority. Indeed, the Prime Minister himself, it is said, at 7 o'clock on election day, went into the study at Chequers and wrote a resignation speech. So we've had this stunning election result. Why? Well, chiefly fear of that appalling woman who comes from north of Hadrian's Wall, who represents the Scottish National Party, a party who are nationalists and socialists at the same time. Did I really say that? Yes, there we are. Well, it's true, so to hell with it. It was really fear of the SNP that gave the Tories this majority. And so now we have a referendum. And it's not going to be easy, but this referendum matters. And it's important for us because I believe in democracy. I believe in self-government. It's important for us because I think our Supreme Court should be the ultimate arbiter in our land. You know, we have a row going on at the moment as to whether prisoners should get the vote. Not a concept that would go very far in America, I don't think. But who decides ultimately whether prisoners get the vote in our electoral system? Well, it won't be our Supreme Court. It'll be the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and that's unacceptable. It's important for me and for UKIP that we win this referendum because I want to turn immigration from being a negative into being a positive, and that's not very hard. All you have to do is to introduce the Australian-style point system, where you say, we want migrants who've got skills. We want migrants who haven't got criminal records. We want migrants who bring their own health insurance. We want migrants who will not be able to claim anything out of the social security system until they've been with us for 5 years, paid their taxes, and obeyed the law. So for all of those reasons, I want our side of the argument to win this referendum. But this isn't just about Britain. This referendum is not just about the future of Britain's relationship with Europe. Actually, if we win this referendum, then in short order, there'll be voices in Finland and in Sweden and in Denmark and in Austria and elsewhere saying, actually, this is the relationship that we want too. Our vision for Europe, and I've been portrayed, over the years as being anti-European, which is absolute nonsense. But I think a better Europe would be a Europe of sovereign, democratic nation-states that trade together, that cooperate together, more of a NATO model, if you like, for how we work together with neighbours than one of political union where we surrender the supremacy of law. And that's why this referendum matters. It matters because if we can win this referendum, we will effectively kill off the whole project of trying to impose against the will of the peoples of the member states of Europe a new form of undemocratic government. And I want people in America perhaps to understand this rather more than they do at the moment, because as I say, I'm getting a bit tired of the Obama line and the State Department line, and I want people in America to understand this, and this perhaps is, I'm now saying this rather more from a British angle than from the representative of parties from across Europe that I'm here with today. The relationship between Britain and America has been a very, very important one. Yeah, we had a little bit of a fallout, didn't we, a couple of 100 years ago, and I understand that. But actually, what Britain and America have done together in terms of fighting for the principles of liberty, democracy, and freedom, and they've done that in the face of some of the most evil aggressors in history, and at great price, we've been successful. We are your greatest ally on this planet. But if we lose this referendum, our ability to continue to be your best ally will diminish by the day. There is a plan, and it's already taking shape, to build a European army, a European Air Force, a European Navy is already active in dealing with Somali pirates in the Gulf. We have, in terms of foreign policy, a European Union that now has over 160 representative offices around the world. And bit by bit, we see British delegations being withdrawn so that we're represented internationally by the European Union. We see a UK Treasury who basically think that one of the benefits of being in the EU is we can cut our defence spending every year to levels that frankly don't make us a credible player on the world stage. This referendum will be won or lost, not on the fine academic arguments about trade policy, important though that is, This referendum will be won or lost on the question of who we are as British people and what we want our role in the future of the world to be. And we should be making the strong, positive case that an independent, democratic Britain that controls its borders and is able to act freely on the international stage with our allies when and where we see fit is the right way forward. And it just would be nice if there were one or two voices from the USA who rather agreed with what I've said to you this morning. Please, can we have no more of Obama telling us how good it is for us? Thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, we have time for questions, and we do want to be able to take as many of those as possible. If you would wait for the microphone to arrive, and then please introduce yourself to our guest, and if you're associated with an organization, tell us who that is. And let's start right over here in this corner.
Hi, Mr. Farage. My name is Jamie Kirchick. I'm a fellow with the Foreign Policy Initiative here in Washington, and I have two somewhat related questions. You mentioned two crises, but one that seems to be missing is Ukraine. It seems to be a pretty big crisis, probably maybe even, in my opinion, more important than the two that you mentioned. And I'm curious as to what your view on that is and what British policy should be, EU policy and whatnot. And somewhat related, I agree with you on the importance of the special relationship with Great Britain. And one of the reasons I'm worried about a Brexit is that without Britain in the EU, we will lose a voice for free markets, free trade, Atlanticism, stronger defense. The EU is not going away, and I think it's better that we have Britain in it. This is from an American perspective, and perhaps that's selfish, but I think it's better that we have Britain in it than without. And so how would you allay those concerns? Thank you.
Okay, point number one. I think what happened in the Ukraine was absolutely appalling, moronic actually. You know, what happened was a democratically elected leader of the Ukraine was brought down by a street stage coup d'etat by people waving European Union flags. And I think the foreign policy that we pursued through NATO, which does need serious reform as an organisation as well, though the model's okay, the foreign policy that we've pursued is we've said we want the Ukraine to join NATO. And politically, the message that the European Union's been pushing, and indeed the biggest cheerleader of all for this has been David Cameron, is we want the Ukraine to join our political union. Well, all of those, frankly, are very provocative acts on Russia and Putin, whatever we think of them. And I think the Ukraine crisis is something that we have provoked, all right? Now, when I make that argument, you know, it doesn't mean that Putin's my best mate or that I want him to be. And I can see why people living in the Baltic states are genuinely concerned about Putin. But can I say this, and this will probably shock you, but we're all told that Putin's a baddie and that Assad's a baddie. All right? These are the really bad guys in the world. Well, let me put this point to you, that actually, when it comes to the biggest threat that we face, which is violent, extreme Islamism, on that great battle, which may well, over the next couple of decades, be the next big terror that we actually have to confront, on those issues, both of those men are on our side. So I do think when it comes to some of this big foreign policy stuff, we need to start thinking not about what's good or the right thing to do for the next 6 months, but where we should be positioning ourselves for the next decade and more. Second point, Britain inside the European Union has lots of influence, and therefore that's good for America because we will convince the EU to be free trade, Atlanticist. I'm sorry, we've been there now for 35 years. We haven't succeeded. One of the most recent statistics over the course of the last 5 years, 65 occasions on which the British government, at the final meeting of the Council, when the final rubber stamp is going on legislation, the last 65 occasions where the British representative said, excuse me, we're not very happy with this, can we have a rethink? I think we've got a 90% record now of losing. So when we've really raised an issue, we've lost 90% of the time. We are not going. Britain has about an 8% share of the vote and the say within the EU. The concept of national vetoes is one that's been watered down and virtually eradicated. And if anybody in Washington thinks that somehow Britain is going to have a reforming influence on the European Union, just look at the way they've talked to and treated Greece over the course of the last few days, and you'll realise these people are obsessed with their project in exactly the same way that the Soviets were obsessed with their communist project. The Soviets used to convince themselves that the reason communism wasn't working is there wasn't enough of it. And if you had more communism, it might succeed, and that's exactly the same with the European Union.
Okay, can we bring a mic down here to the front row?
Hi, pardon me. Hi, Carl Golovin. I've heard it said that you believe gold is actually money and not credit borrowed into existence at usury, which is the foundation of most central banking. I just wanted to comment that America was founded as a constitutional republic based in part on the writings of Roger Sherman, who put in our Constitution, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt." He wrote in Caveat Against Injustice in 1752, subtitled "On the Evils of a Fluctuating Medium of Exchange," how if there are multiple systems of paper money, that they can be differentially inflated in order to steal wealth one from the other, as seems to really be what's happening between Germany and Greece. All of that pointing towards what the Bretton Woods agreements were supposed to be, where gold was the anchor of honesty in international trade. What do you think about Iceland as a geopolitical focal point for a new Bretton Woods, where each nation could bring some gold and hold each other accountable to not overinflating our currencies and dumping them into each other's economies?
No, and I get the point about the way governments are able to inflate currencies, and I certainly get the point about the way that governments, I mean my government back in Britain through quantitative easing and all sorts of extraordinary tricks, have behaved over the last few years. But the simplistic argument that we should return to the gold standard is not one I buy. The trouble with going to the gold standard is a fixed system of currency pegs based on gold, if you think about it, is actually rather like a slightly bigger version and an even more rigid version of being in the euro. It doesn't give countries that are having good times or bad times the ability for their currency to fluctuate. So I'm not sold on the idea of returning to the gold standard, though I am sold on the idea that as electorates, we're going to have to start making our governments rather more accountable for the sheer level of debt they're piling up. And it's one of the very difficult things to discuss. One of the narratives that we got from Cameron and from Osborne, the Chancellor, in the general election is vote Conservative because we have been prudent. We've been the prudent government. And actually, in the space of 5 years, they've doubled our national debt. They increased our debt levels in 5 years more than the Labour Party managed to do in 13 years. It's quite some achievement, really, when you think about it, isn't it? So, yes, I do want governments to be more responsible, but I don't buy a return to the gold standard.
Okay, let's go back over here. I see lots of hands. The gentleman in the back row, and then we'll do you next.
Hi, Nigel. As a British Conservative, what makes it tough to support what you're saying or to believe in what you're trying to do is you're very vague about if Britain leaves the European Union, what it's going to do next. So trade agreements and being more friendly with the United States basically isn't enough. Britain is an intellectually much bigger country than that, and needs to form alliances around the world on trade, military, government affairs. And what are the principles that we should use to do that? Well, is it parliamentary democracy? Is it just English speaking? Is it military? We need to really investigate that a lot more before making this jump. We need to know what to do next.
Okay, well, William Dartmouth is going to speak very specifically on trade and how potentially our trade situation is better not being tied into this old-fashioned concept of a customs union. What was interesting was to hear you say about what a big country we are, which is very interesting because the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, even the Prime Minister are on record as saying they don't think Britain is big enough and good enough and strong enough to negotiate our own trade deals on the world stage. And when I mentioned Iceland earlier, if a country of 250,000 can negotiate a trade deal with China, I'm damn certain we can. I look at Switzerland, who've got more genuine FTAs around the world than we've got as EU members. But you're right about one thing. One thing that the No campaign has to do in the run-up to this referendum is to come up with some quite definitive answers on these things. My current position is quite simple. You know, if the Swiss can get a deal that suits them, and the Norwegians can get a deal that suits them, and if Mexico can have exactly the same terms of trade with Europe that we've got at the moment, but without being members and without paying 1% of our GDP as a membership fee, I'm sure that we, as now the Eurozone's biggest export market in the world, can get our own bespoke deal with the EU. And after that, do you know something? If you do business with countries that speak the same language as you, and if you do business with countries that have common law and countries that have recognisable contract law, you actually find there are huge trade advantages to wiping away tariffs and barriers with those countries. And I would see the first areas for the UK to prosper with new FTAs would indeed, yes, be with the English-speaking parts of the world. You know, it's a no-brainer that that's a very good, quick, easy place to start.
Okay, yes, right here, and then we'll come back over to this side.
Mr. Farage, my name is Bob Patterson. I write for the Philadelphia Inquirer, just 3 hours north of here. Could you share your perspective? I know you don't live in America, but do you sense that America faces the exact same threats to sovereignty, independence, autonomy as Britain? And I guess what I'm particularly asking is, like, this recent Obama trade deal that went through was all pushed by Goldman Sachs, all the big banks, all the same people that are pushing the European zone. And these deals aren't really about free trade. They're more about what maybe more integration on an economic level. So could you care to share your perspective if the United States faces the same kind of dangers that England faces? And then my last question, real quick. Would you be considered the Donald Trump of England?
I'm pretty sure that if the EU was to try and expand itself across the Atlantic, Obama would be the first to sign America up to it. Obama loves this concept of big supranational organizations, whether it's international courts, whether it's the EU, whether it's the United Nations, and we've got this breed of people, and they all work hand in glove, and you're quite right. It's the unholy trinity, isn't it? Between big government, big banks, and big corporate businesses. And what is happening with these new so-called trade deals and everything else, what is happening is we're seeing a victory of corporatism over capitalism. And it is the job for those with genuine conservative voices to start making the arguments for capitalism, for popular free market capitalism, which is actually being crushed by big business and big government corporatism, who are setting up a framework and a rule book that makes the costs of market entry to any potential competitors too damn difficult, and hands the world over to a few big companies. So yes, there are great similarities. I also feel very strongly that immigration is increasingly becoming a big argument in America, and much as we were told what terrible people we were to even dare to raise the issue, we've now made it a mainstream debate, and I suspect in America, this immigration debate about who is coming, in what numbers and what quantity they are, that will also become a big debate. I just have to say, slightly selfishly, back to you from my side of the pond, it would be nice if America had a president who actually liked my country, because the current one doesn't appear to. Now, in terms of Donald Trump, I will avoid all comparisons with Donald Trump, but I like to think of myself as the updated Henry VIII. That's about where I fit in. All right.
Okay, let's come right here to the second row.
Hello, Mr. Farage. My name is Jordan Harms. I'm a student at Georgetown University. And props to the man who suggested you're Donald Trump, because if I was British, I definitely would vote for you. My question is two-pronged, and they're both similar in theme. One primary concern, you touched on it briefly, about the Islamic State. We call it ISIS or ISIL, whichever suits us. But one primary concern that I think the European Union faces is the problem of foreign fighters. And I'm sure you know especially about these British citizens who regularly travel to join ISIS, not necessarily because they have any love for Sharia law, but simply because they're disgusted by what they see in their own country and in their own societies. especially now with the fate, with the recent deal of Iran and in the nuclear scheme of things, what do you see? What is the best strategy that the European Union, or at least in terms of Britain, can do to assuage this problem of ISIS, this problem of foreign fighters?
Okay. All right. On the Donald Trump point, seriously, I do think some of the things he's picked up on in the last few weeks are very similar to the kind of themes that we picked up on in British politics, a feeling that there is a centralised bureaucracy in Washington, maybe not connecting with some of the concerns of ordinary people. Look, we've been very, very good over the last decade and more about worrying what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa and Afghanistan. And we've been very busy intervening in all these places, and we've been almost negligent in the growth of jihadism within our own communities. And when I said last year, to the usual howls of outrage, when I said last year that we now have a fifth column living inside our own countries, they carry our passports, they speak our language, and they hate us. They want to kill us. They want to overthrow our culture, our constitution, our whole way of life. My own view is we should worry a bit more about what's happening within our countries than what is happening across the rest of the world. And I think that is going to be the politics of the future. I think we've intervened too much militarily around the world without always thinking about what this may mean for the longer term. And we must focus on our own countries. And, part of that, it seems to me, needs to be, we have got to be more assertive in saying who we are as a nation, what our values are, what those that built your great country and built mine, what they represented. In the case of my country, we actually have a Christian constitution. We have a Church of England. It is the established state church. And yet our leaders in recent years, whether they're political or even some of our bishops, appear to be almost ashamed to stand up and defend our culture and who we are. So we need to be more muscular about this. And the man that I admire hugely from the Conservative movement over the course of the last sort of 30, 40 years is the Australian John Howard. John Howard, who won 4 elections, and Howard, who said, his big message to immigrants coming to Australia is, if you've got a trade or skill to bring and you can make this a better country, you're welcome. And we couldn't care less whether you're black or white or yellow or whatever you are. We couldn't care less what your religion is. We're not interested. But if you come here, you speak our language, you integrate with our society, you become part of our Australian dream. If you don't want to do those things, don't bother coming in the first place. And isn't that what we need to do, to be a bit more assertive? On the issue of foreign fighters, David Cameron's big push now is that when they find out that someone wants to leave the country and go and fight in Syria for ISIS or ISIL or whatever we call it, that we now stop them leaving the country. Well, I'd pay their ticket and then take away their passport and make sure they never ever come back.
Okay, the back corner there, and then down here to the front row.
Hi, Stefan Grober with Euronews. What is your view on the Iran deal? You haven't really touched upon this.
I think he's probably going too far too fast. Is the idea that you talk to people a good idea? Of course it is, whoever they are. You should always be talking to people. Is the removal of sanctions a good thing? Well, if you're filling your car up with gas over the next 5 years, it might be quite a good thing. Have we gone too far in terms of the nuclear provisions? Well, actually, unless I'm mistaken, unless something fundamental has changed, don't they still want to blow Israel off the face of the earth? That's at least what I think. So unless there's been some massive shift in the Iranian stance on the existence of Israel as a state, unless that's happened and I haven't noticed, then I think Obama has gone too far.
Okay, right here.
Hi, Ian Oscar. I'm with the Washington Ireland programme. Sorry, it's a bit of a selfish question. But you advocate that the UK should leave the EU. Northern Ireland currently in tax raises about 11 billion a year, yet they take about 23 billion from the UK purse. They've also had an awful lot of money recently from the European Peace Fund, and I was wondering if you considered the implications for Northern Ireland and leaving the EU.
Oh, money. Isn't it great? Wonderful, isn't it? I tell you what, you give me 20 quid, and I'll give you 10 quid back, and you then tell the room how much better off you are. Because that's effectively what's happening. I mean, we as a nation put £55 million a day into the European Union, who incidentally haven't had their accounts signed off by the auditors for 18 years in a row, but never mind. And we get about half of that money back. Most of that money comes back to pay people to own land, and indeed, as Roger will tell you, to put those wonderful wind turbines on them. They're terrific wind turbines. They really work well. Roger will explain it all later, I'm sure. So we get about half of our money back. We're a massive net contributor to this union in terms of pure cash. But if you actually look at the cost to small business of an excessive rule book, you know, whether it's environmental or health and safety or employment legislation, you actually start to quantify what the costs are. They are massive. What the EU are very good at doing, they're good at trying to buy people off with their own money. I've often said that Stalin used to kill his opponents, and what the European Union do is to bribe their opponents. And so we get people like Neil Kinnock, who was the last prime ministerial contender to advocate in the 80s we should not be part of this political project, and they make him a European commissioner for 10 years and give him a great big salary. As far as Northern Ireland's concerned, they've tried their very best in Brussels to show how wonderful they are by supporting various peace initiatives. Despite all of that, actually Northern Ireland is probably the most Eurosceptic place in the world, because not only are the Unionists, you know, the DUP in particular, very, very strongly against European Union, but actually, unlike the Scottish nationalists, Sinn Féin do have some, I'm not being nice about Sinn Féin, by the way, but Sinn Féin do have some sincerity in that they believe that the island of Ireland should be independent. So I'm pretty confident, come the referendum, that Northern Ireland will be strongly in the no camp. Our problem in winning this referendum is going to be London and Greater London and the number of people that work for the big banks that we've discussed in this room today. Those that are doing very nicely out of the status quo will be our problem.
Right here in the middle?
How are we doing?
We're going to. Now, this needs to be, we've got a few more questions, but in order to keep our time, we've got just a few minutes left, so let's try to make these questions tight. We've got two more then, and then we'll call it the time.
Yes, I'm Russell King. Bobby Jindal recently made a public statement about the so-called no-go zones in British cities and European cities, and the British Prime Minister and Mayor of London disagreed with him. The best of my understanding, it's in Muslim areas maybe where they might have Sharia law. You don't have the entire national law there. And there are hate speech laws, I believe, in Britain and Sweden that sort of mean you cannot make even innocuous statements about some immigrant groups. Can you discuss the hate speech laws and the no-go zones, whether or not they exist or not?
It's very easy. I just send you about 20 front pages from the Times newspaper over the last 2 years condemning me for some sort of form of appalling bigotry. I mean, you're right, we can't tell the truth anymore. I mean, with the Romanian migration that we've seen into Britain, a lot of it organised and run by organised criminal gangs. So we now have a situation where over 90% of ATM crime in London is committed by Romanian gangs. And yet if I say that, I'm accused of being racist. I mean, it really is quite difficult. Does Britain have no-go zones? I suspect that France has a much bigger problem with this than Britain. I think there are quite large parts of the urban areas in big French cities that are really seriously problematic. I don't think Britain has no-go zones as such, but have we pursued a policy of turning a blind eye because it's easier to do so? Well, let me just give you one very quick, I promise, example. In a medium-sized northern town called Rotherham, population about probably 350,000 people. We have just uncovered in the last few months the grooming and sexual abuse of 1,400 girls. 1,400 girls in a town of that size have been serially sexually abused and raped, and over 95% of the perpetrators have come from one specific religious and ethnic group. And yet, because they were seen to be Pakistani Muslim men, clearly what has happened is the police and the local authorities thought it better to allow this kind of thing to continue rather than to confront it and to be thought to be racist. It really goes back, if you like, to what I was trying to say earlier. We have to start having more self-confidence in who we are, what our values are, and asserting them.
Right here in the front row, and then the young man in the green shirt will be our last question.
Hi, Mr. Farage. Thanks very much for coming. I'm Michael Shaw. I'm from Northern Ireland. You
I
can
guess
probably
that,
hear. Yeah.
There's a lot of it about, isn't there?
I can't wait to join a campaign to leave the European Union.
Give a round of applause.
But I was absolutely disgusted to see the establishment round on you and collude to ensure that you didn't get into Parliament. Is it possible that we're just going to see more collusion between the established parties and their corporate bodies to ensure that there's not a fair fight in the referendum?
This is the biggest political decision that we've faced for many, many decades. This is it. This is the big one. And I talked earlier about people who work for the big guy. You are going to see the most massive coming together of the vested interests whose lives work as part of this corporatist project. Whether they're big landowners who now can bring in labour from Lithuania, at a very, very low cost, whether it's the big banks who benefited from it, we are going to see a coming together. Probably the levels of nastiness and unpleasantness that I've come up against so far will be seen as nothing yet compared to what's going to come over the next 12 or 18 months, depending exactly when the date is. So we've got the modern-day Battle of Britain on our hands. And it would be nice, and I know you're from Northern Ireland, and I look forward to seeing you on the campaign trail, I hope, but it would be nice if as a result of this visit of a group of us from the European Parliament, it would be nice if we started to hear one or two American voices actually speaking up and saying that an independent Britain would be good for America in the world to counteract Obama and the State Department. And that might just help us win this referendum.
Okay, the young man in the green shirt, he'll be our final question. Okay. And then you can make any wrap-up comments you might have.
Hello, Mr. Farage. My name is Alex, and I have two questions that are semi-related. Being the leader of an insurgent political force that's more related to the right wing, how do you view the current state of the modern Republican Party and the divide between the more establishment and anti-establishment groups? And also, I had the pleasure of seeing you speak at CPAC this year. Do you know if you'll be invited next year or if you'll be doing any more speaking events in the States?
Generally in life, I find that when I've been invited somewhere once, I never get invited back. But so we'll just have to see on that one. The reason that UKIP in the end won the European elections and managed to hold up very respectably in the general election despite this big surge and this big fear of that ghastly woman from north of Hadrian's Wall, whose party is both nationalist and socialist, I couldn't resist it. The reason is, and look, I was, before getting involved in politics, I was a member of the Conservative Party. Why was I a member of the Conservative Party? I thought Mrs. Thatcher was a very necessary thing when she came and brought in the reforms that modernised Britain, painful though some of them were. So I would have considered myself traditionally to be on the centre-right of British politics. What I've learned through UKIP is there are some issues that are so fundamentally important that the old labels of left and right become completely irrelevant. And by talking about sensible immigration controls and the shape of our communities and the wage levels of those in skilled, semi-skilled and unskilled jobs, what we've done is to reach out across the political spectrum and, in fact, in many ways to bridge the class divide that exists in British politics. And I'm very proud of the fact that we've done that. And I can't really, and I shouldn't really, comment much on the Republican Party, but my observation would be that the Republican Party doesn't seem to pick on those issues these days that cross that bridge in that same way. And Ronnie Reagan when he was around, who was a pretty remarkable fellow, it seemed to me, what Ronnie Reagan did was to go for big issues that reached across the left-right divide, and you had the phenomenon of the Reagan Democrats. No Conservative party, in the Western world can ever win a majority if they haven't got significant blue-collar support. And that is what I think the Republican Party needs to do, and I think it failed to do that at the last election in quite a big way. We've run over time. I want to say a big thanks to my invigilator, Becky. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you once again to Heritage, and thank you to the audience for being so charming and nice. Normally when I stand up and address an audience like this, it's in the European Parliament, and most of them want to throw things at me. So this morning has been quite gentle by comparison. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's refreshing to have a person who is leading a party and leading a movement come and speak with such clarity. And even when you disagree with someone, it's nice to know that people have strong views and are willing to express them and to take questions. My husband actually worked for a senator from North Carolina whose name was Senator Jesse Helms, who was quite conservative and a great hero to those of us at the Heritage Foundation. And he had lots of people who disagreed with him in North Carolina. In fact, the saying is he never won a poll, but he never lost an election. Because even people in North Carolina who disagreed with Senator Helms were grateful that they had a man who was principled enough to say what he believed and then come to Washington and be true to his word. So it's refreshing to have leaders who speak out forcefully, and we appreciate the Honorable Nigel Farage coming to speak today. Now we're going to turn to the next part of our program, which has even more people who are willing to speak out forcefully for what they believe. And I'm going to introduce the moderator of the panel, and then he will introduce the panelists and lead the program. The moderator of our next panel is a colleague of mine here at the Heritage Foundation, Joel Anand Samy. He serves as the Senior Advisor for Strategic Outreach for the Heritage Foundation. And in this role, his emphasis is identifying new audiences of people who share our principles and values and engaging them and talking to them about conservative principles and how all these things do fit together. He served as Vice President of Jonathan and David Incorporated and Treasurer Trustee of the Jonathan and David Foundation, and he also led the marketing, communications, and advertising activities as a senior executive at Zondervan HarperCollins Publishers, which is now a division of News Corporation. Joel is the co-founder of the International Leaders Summit, which is a unique platform which is building a network of successful reformers and free market proponents in the U.S., Europe, and India, and engaging entrepreneurs, business, media, and political leaders to advance pro-growth reform initiatives. Joel also spent a number of years in Europe working with reform leaders, and he co-founded the think tank, the Adriatic Institution, with Natasha Serdok in advancing the rule of law and economic freedom. He co-authored a book with Natasha Serdok for Southeast Europe titled Flat Tax, The Case for Tax Reform, which was used by reformers in implementing the flat tax. Please welcome my colleague, Joel, and he will then introduce the panel and lead the next discussion on some very interesting issues. Joel, welcome.
Indeed, thank you, Becky, for your leadership. In fact, it was just several months ago that Becky Norton-Dunlop, Natasha Serdok, and I were in the European Parliament with members of the UKIP group and the broader delegation. And during our time there, Becky Norton-Dunlop shared the importance of advancing economic freedom, the rule of law, protection of property rights, and shared the Index of Economic Freedom published by the Heritage Foundation in partnership with the Wall Street Journal. And economic freedom is exactly what our speakers will be communicating in just a few minutes here. And it is best to probably appropriately quote Lady Thatcher, a notable patriot and principal leader who relayed this in a speech delivered on October 18, 1979. Modern liberty rests upon three pillars. They are representative democracy, economic freedom, and the rule of law. The foundation of all three is the acceptance by the members of societies of a sense of common obligation. And Lady Thatcher continued by stating, representative political institutions cannot alone guarantee our liberties. It is economic liberty that nourishes the enterprise of those whose hard work and imagination ultimately determine conditions in which we live. It is economic liberty that makes possible a free press and the questions asked today. It is economic liberty that has enabled the modern democratic state to provide a decent minimum of welfare for the citizen. And in fact, she said, if the economic life of the country is dominated by the state, few of these things are true. And indeed, she stood for economic freedom and the advancement of the rule of law. And at this moment, I'd like to invite our speakers here, members of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom. It is my great pleasure to introduce these individuals, these distinguished individuals. They will cover the topics of economic freedom, free trade, and the significance of sovereignty. And each one has an impressive resume. And in order to allow them to certainly have ample time, I'll just take a brief opportunity to share their bios with you. Roger Helmer, who I've known for some 10 years now, working with him and on European issues. It's a great delight to have you here in Washington, Roger. He's been an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, since 1999. Graduating from Cambridge with a bachelor's and a master's, Roger went on to hold various marketing and general management positions with major multinationals, working both in the United Kingdom and overseas. Along with representing his constituents, Roger is also the UKIP spokesman on energy and industry. He has led the debate in calling for Britain to have a rational energy policy, believing current green energy initiatives are making British business less competitive and costing jobs. Roger is also the leader of the 24-strong UKIP delegation. In fact, I must emphasize this here, the largest UK delegation in Brussels. And our second speaker on the panel is William Dartmouth. William Dartmouth was educated at Eton College before going up to Christ Church, Oxford, for his master's, where he was elected an officer of the Oxford University Conservative Association and later of the Oxford Union Society. William Dartmouth was elected as a second UKIP MEP for the South West England region and in the European Parliament election of 2009 and re-elected in 2014 as the first UKIP MEP. In the European Parliament, he sits with the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy group and on the Committee on International Trade. He has been the UKIP national spokesman on trade since 2010. Paul Nuttall, who is seated on his left, is deputy leader of UKIP and a member of the European Parliament for the northwest of England. And notably, Paul was UKIP's youngest ever chairman, and when first elected, he was UKIP's youngest ever MEP. He is a former history lecturer. And without further ado, I'd certainly like to welcome Roger to the podium, and we will then certainly go through the speakers with William Dartmouth and Paul Nuttall.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to be in America, it's great to be in Washington, and it is great to be with the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking Heritage, thanking Becky Norton-Dunlop, thanking also Joel for all the work he's done on making this session today possible. And I can't stand here in the Heritage Foundation without reflecting with some satisfaction that a former staffer of mine, Sally McNamara, who was with me for about 5 years, subsequently came to Heritage and was a staffer with Heritage also for a number of years. So the connection goes way back. Now we're here in exciting times. As you've already heard, the European Union faces a range of crises. We've talked about the ongoing euro crisis, which affects Greece, but also affects Italy and Spain and Portugal and indeed the whole Eurozone. We've talked about the crisis of the Ukraine, where we have President Putin posturing on the periphery, if I may say so. We have the looming crisis of British independence, which will be the subject, we hope, of a referendum in the next year or two. But I want to talk to you very briefly about another crisis facing the European Union. It is quite simply a crisis of competitiveness, and the reason the European Union faces a crisis of competitiveness is very simple. We have extraordinarily high energy prices. These energy prices, ladies and gentlemen, are not the result of some accident of nature or some act of God. They are the result of deliberate policies which the European Union has undertaken. And that is not merely the opinion of a right-wing ideologue. That is also the opinion of recent outgoing industry commissioner Antonio Tajani. He served as a commissioner for industry and vice president of the Commission for 5 years. And he said, using language which is extremely strong for a European commissioner, he said, we have created an industrial massacre in Europe. And that is what is going on at the moment. And the reason is very simple. It is because while everybody in the world is talking about climate change paranoia, the only country or group of countries that has gone as far as the European Union is, of course, the European Union itself. It is piling up competitive disadvantage. And as I will argue, briefly, Chairman, as I will argue, it is not achieving the result that it had hoped to achieve. It is not reducing CO2 emissions, if that is its objective. It is arguably increasing CO2 emissions, and I will tell you why. Let me briefly, though, tell you where we, UKIP, as a party, stand on this issue. We do not share the general paranoia about CO2 emissions. I would speak to you very happily for an hour and a half on climate change, the arguments for and against. I haven't got the time to do that, so I must just invite you to take that as read. My point today is not to argue that CO2 is not a cause of climate change. My point today is to argue that the actions we are taking for climate mitigation, A, have no chance of succeeding even in their own terms, and B, are destroying Europe's economic competitiveness. By the way, I would add that we, of course, recognize that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but we believe that it is only one minor factor. There are much larger factors, including long-term natural cyclical changes that affect global climate. And indeed, I would say there is a strong argument that the increases in atmospheric CO2 over the last 150 years are driven more by natural cyclical changes in temperature rather than man-made CO2 emissions causing the temperature changes. We have observed natural climate cycles going back certainly for 10,000 years during the current interglacial and arguably for much longer. I love the way that the Greens talk about the pre-industrial situation, bearing in mind that, of course, the pre-industrial period on Earth was about 4.5 billion years, which is about 99.999% of Earth history. And during that period, climate changed enormously. There were ice ages, there were warm periods. There were many periods when CO2 levels were much higher than today, but there was never runaway global warming. If the theory were right, then surely such warming would have taken place. Let me come, though, to the present time. We have a situation where Europe is imposing massive controls and restrictions on CO2 emissions and investing enormously in renewables. Our position is that we want to deliver secure and affordable energy supplies, and we believe we can do that by using proven energy technologies that are economical, and those would include coal and gas and nuclear. We are not opposed to renewables in principle, but we would argue that renewables should take their place when they are economic and when market forces make it feasible for them to be used. That situation has not arisen yet. It will not happen to wind. It may happen to solar, and when it does, we should all be very happy about that. But what Europe is doing is creating an environment where large energy-intensive businesses are simply moving offshore. Recently, I had meetings with the European aluminium industry, or as you would say, aluminum industry. Had those meetings in Brussels, and I was astonished by the statistics. In the last 7 years, something like 35% of European aluminum capacity has actually moved offshore. You may say, well, there's been a recession. Of course, we're using less of the material. Not at all. Aluminum usage is increasing in Europe, but production is going down and imports are increasing. The same story applies to a whole list of energy-intensive businesses. It applies to steel, cement, chemicals, petroleum refining. All these industries, they're closing plants in Europe. They are moving them offshore. That is a situation that is hugely damaging to European economies, and it has the perverse effect of moving production out of the EU to other jurisdictions which actually have much looser environmental regulations. There's a recent British government report showing that imported refined petroleum products actually imply 35% higher CO2 emissions than if those products had been refined in Europe. And there is certainly anecdotal evidence from the steel industry suggesting that a ton of steel made in Shanghai implies double the CO2 emissions of a ton of steel made in Sheffield. So we have a policy which at the same time is closing plants, costing jobs, moving investment offshore, but also failing in its primary objective of reducing CO2 emissions and even arguably increasing those emissions. They call it carbon leakage. I call it madness. And in closing, I would like just to pass on a message that I hope will be relevant to this country, because we've heard a little bit in Nigel Farage's speech about President Obama, and of course President Obama does seem to be rather committed to an extensive CO2 reduction program. In fact, your country has been extremely successful in reducing CO2 emissions by switching from coal to gas for very good economic reasons, and that demonstrates, in fact, that you do not have to cover the country in wind farms in order to achieve that outcome. What I would do is I would appeal to you to look at the disaster that has been created in Europe. Look at the problems that Germany has created with its excessive investment in solar power in particular, in old-fashioned solar power, which in 5-10 years' time we'll look back on and say, why on earth did we waste so much money on these clunky, old-fashioned, inefficient systems? It may be in 10 years' time we have solar technology that is absolutely economic. I don't know. Let's see. But let's not invest on a large scale in wholly uneconomic renewables. I would be able to think of many reasons why it would be extremely smart to elect a Republican president next time around. But from my point of view, as energy spokesman for my party, one of the biggest reasons for doing that is that you might elect somebody who would not seek to bypass Congress by using the EPA, somebody who would not pursue the Paris process, which is now being negotiated, somebody who would put economic rationalism ahead of climate paranoia. I commend to you the program of getting a Republican president elected next time.
Thank you very much. William?
All right, thank you. So I thought the mic. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming here. I thought it was going to be like the waters parting of the Red Sea when Nigel Farage left. So I very much appreciate the people who are here. I think I'm going to go straight into this. I have the honour to be UKIP National Spokesman on trade, so I'm principally going to be talking about trade with some basic facts and some other things with the help of slides. Now, it's not widely appreciated just how much of the UK's ability to run its own affairs, to run its own affairs, have been handed over to the European Union, the EU. Trade, which I cover, is a power of the EU. What in the jargon is called an exclusive competence. In consequence, the United Kingdom does not have the right to negotiate or enter into trade agreements for itself. By contrast, the former British colony not so very far from here, of Belize, does have that right and takes full advantage of it. And it's not just trade. 75% of our laws emanate from the EU. We have, as far as the EU is concerned, open borders. Our commerce, business and industries are hampered by alien EU regulation. Our English common law is made inferior to the rulings of foreign courts. Our National Health Service is hobbled by EU directives. Our people can be subjected to the European arrest warrant. Our fish are stolen. We cannot even choose how we tax cider, how our ovens work, what vacuum cleaners we have. The European Commission extends its sway over the UK even onto light bulbs. A country within the European Union has less autonomy than a state within the United States. Now let us go back to trade. Next, NAFTA. In trade terms, the North American Free Trade Area is approximately the same size as the EU. And you can see that just over 70% of the exports of Mexico went to the two other countries in NAFTA. With Canada, the equivalent figure is almost 80%. By comparison, between the UK and the other EU countries, the proportion of UK trade is less than half, less than 45%, and that figure is falling. Nevertheless, we are constantly told that because maybe 45% of our exports go to the EU, that is in itself sufficient reason for the UK to be in the EU political union. Now, again to the European Union and trade. The essential background is that the UK has been a leader in international trade for centuries, long before the European Union was even thought of. Next. Now this slide shows the value of trade between 20 countries outside the EU and the EU member states in 2013. And you will note the sheer value of this, 2,593 billion euros. Now, figures are inherently comparative, and to put it in another way, in 2013, the value of this trade was worth more than the entire economy of France. For that matter, it was worth more than our economy in the UK, and it was even worth more than Tony Blair and Cherry Blair got paid last year. It is also important to note that all three of the top 3 trading countries with the EU, 6 of the top 10, 11 of the top 20 do not have trade agreements with the European Union. These countries trade and trade successfully with the European Union within the framework and under the rules of the World Trade Organization. That is one option for the UK after exit, and one that is always available. The EU cannot block it. Even the federalist diehards and fanatics in the EU Commission and the EU Parliament cannot block it. Next slide, please. Many will assume, because it seems logical, that a member state of the EU will inevitably export more per head of population to other member states than a country which is not a member state. It seems logical. Let's take a look at Switzerland, which, to be clear, is not a member of the EU. As the slide shows, Switzerland has consistently exported to the EU a multiple per head of what we manage in the UK, and the average is over 4.5 times. The point is this: a country does not have to be in the European Union in order to be able to trade with it and trade very successfully. The UK would absolutely not be leaving EU markets on exiting the EU. It is crystal clear, and the facts demonstrate it. The trade would continue. But this is unfortunately what David Cameron and Ed Miliband and all the usual suspects this is not what these people have been telling the British electorate. So if you can't justify our membership of the European Union in terms of trade, I'll be returning to it a little bit later. Our membership of the European Union is also justified on the basis of what they call influence. So let's look at the facts, and I particularly commend this to the gentleman over there. First, next, EU commissioners. Here's a slide, though I'm not sure that we need it. The UK originally appointed 2 commissioners out of 13. We now appoint just 1 of 28. For the mathematically minded, the percentage of UK appointed commissioners is now just 3.6%. Next, let's take a look at MEPs from the UK. MEPs are actually not very important, except for my 2 colleagues. The UK used to have 19.8% of MEPs. Now we have less than half that, less than 10%. Next, let's look at the UK's vote in the Council of Ministers. It used to be 17%. It also is now less than half that the 17% figure, just 8.24%. The consequence of that is that, as Nigel said earlier on, the UK tried to block proposals from the EU Commission in the Council 55 times in the last 10 years, including in the period of the Labour government. And in those 55 times, they failed 55 times. The fact of the matter is that the UK has no meaningful influence in the EU, and we do not have the influence in the EU to be an effective ally for the United States. State Department, please note. Now back to trade. When we exit the EU, we regain our ability to negotiate our own trade agreements for ourselves. Next, to go back to Switzerland, a country with an economy 1/4 the size of the UK's, Switzerland can negotiate its own trade agreements now, and this slide shows how Switzerland has done. We can see that the EU has trade agreements which Switzerland does not have with Algeria, Andorra, and San Marino. By comparison, Switzerland has trade agreements which the EU does not have with Canada, China, and Japan. And it's not just Switzerland. Chile, New Zealand, Iceland, as Nigel Farage said, unlike the UK, can negotiate their own trade agreements. And Chile, New Zealand, Iceland all have trade agreements with China. Even Belize has an investment agreement with China. The EU does not have any such agreement or agreements and will not anytime soon. Now, next, the arguments about trade tends to be put in terms of being an EU member or not an EU member. The fact of the matter is that the EU has got multiple trade arrangements with multiple countries of different kinds. Now, I'm actually going to have to read this in front of me. There's, first of all, in ascending order of integration, I'm going to go through this at lightning speed. There's the WTO USA option, no trade agreement at all, which is the current situation and has been for the last 40 years. There are 58 trade agreements, including with, for example, Mexico and South Korea, with 12 further ones in negotiation. There's the GSP, there's a general scheme of trade preferences, and the general and also there's a GSP plus. The total is over 100 countries. We make that 109 countries, and incidentally, with no free movement. Next. Something should happen now. Next. Ooh, it can go one back. No, we seem to have lost it. Anyway, there's also the interesting situation for Monaco, Andorra, and Turkey, which are in the EU customs union without being EU member states. So can I also go to the next slide? So what is it that we advocate for the UK in the future? And that's a very, very important question. Do we advocate the WTO option? Do we advocate the EFTA option? I think we now found the slide. The EEA option? Do we advocate the Switzerland option? Do we advocate EU customs union like San Marino, Turkey, and Monaco? The answer is we advocate none of the above. What we advocate, we certainly don't advocate the political union, because that's what we want to get out of. What we do advocate, can we go to the scissors? What we do advocate is that, and if you can possibly forgive the gigantic pun, a tailor-made, bespoke, custom-made UK-EU trade agreement, which, if you can forgive the massive pun, which is of a kind that suits our economy. And that, I believe, and so therefore, we in UKIP have a dream. Our dream is of an independent country that is not a province in a protectionist European superstate, that is international and outward-looking, that can make its own choices, that can control its own borders, that has an ethical immigration policy, and that can be an effective ally for the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. This is very unusual for me. I usually speak without any notes, a bit like Nigel, but I decided to go back to the future, really, and sort of give a lecture like I used to do at the university many years ago. And what I want to talk about is pretty much supranational structures and their effects on the nation state. Now, as the deputy leader of a political party that is committed to the ultimate sovereignty of my own state, then I'm sure you'll permit me to focus this talk on the European Union. Now, I'm not sure how much Americans know about the EU and its structures. Moreover, I'm not sure how many of you understand how Britain got itself entangled into this organisation in the first place. Therefore, before I lead on to talk about how the EU has ambitions and its relationship with the nation state, please permit me at this juncture to explain how this organisation came about and why Britain felt it needed to become a part of it. In 1904, the former British Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, confidently announced that the day of small nations has passed away, the day of empires has come. Within 15 years of Chamberlain's assertion, the unprecedented massacre of the First World War altered the map in a way that no one at the turn of that century could have foreseen. The great empires of Russia, Germany, the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans had disappeared, and a great power of the New World had entered the arena. Whereas wars can be the destroyer of empires, they can also be a creator, or indeed facilitate expansion. The United States was the prime beneficiary of the First World War, primarily because her economic strength helped tip the balance in the latter years of the conflict, but also because her main competitors were significantly weakened by the slaughter. For example, geographically, the British Empire was larger in the 1920s than at any point in its history, but it was a charade, because the British Empire, above all, was an economic empire, and economically, Britain was, by the 1920s, a broken nation. As a result, many of the British dominions in this interwar period, including Canada and Australia, began to increasingly look at the world's new superpower rather than to the mother country. Indeed, the traditional blood ties that bound the countries of the old world began to falter, only to be replaced by the consumer links of the new. The world also dabbled in its first supranational structure in this period, the League of Nations. The League was set up following the First World War to act as judge and jury on the world's problems and to ensure that the horrors of 1914 to 18 were not repeated. As Churchill once said, "War is always preferable to war." Unfortunately, the League was a failure, and there is no more suitable place than Washington, D.C. to highlight why the League failed. Because although the United States was instrumental in its construction and launch, it never actually joined the organisation, which in reality left it toothless when dealing with the expansionist ambitions of Hitler, Mussolini and Hirohito. The final straw for the old empires came through the weakness of the League of Nations and more continental woes. In many ways, Britain sacrificed her empire and global influence in her refusal to negotiate a peace with Nazi Germany in 1940. Instead, Britain stood alone. And we stood alone and we refused to buckle for the most noblest of causes, the defeat and destruction of Hitler and Nazism. And I personally think that is something that Britain can be very proud about. The rigours of war left Britain tired and in many ways a broken nation, devoid of strength or a will to uphold the empire or maintain global leadership. Indeed, one could easily argue, and historians have, that although Britain won the war, she lost the peace. Following the Second World War, there was a consensus, not just in Britain, but all over the world, that this must never happen again. Indeed, in Europe, which had been the catalyst to the two world wars, there was an overwhelming desire for reconciliation, even if that meant the pooling of national sovereignty. As a result, in 1958, the Treaty of Rome brought together 6 nations under the umbrella of the European Economic Community, which was determined, and I quote, to lay the foundations of an ever closer union amongst the people of Europe. At this point, the British looked on curiously from the sidelines. Winston Churchill had made it clear that although Britain should support European integration, she would always, and I quote, choose the open sea. Indeed, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden was even more cynical when he informed MPs that European integration in the form that was being proposed was doomed to failure. Instead, Britain believed that Europe should move towards free trade rather than the customs union that was being proposed by Germany and France. As a consequence, Britain moved to create a rival organisation in 1960 called the European Free Trade Area, EFTA, which included nations such as Portugal, Austria, Norway and Switzerland, and still survives till this day. Now, please do not misinterpret what I'm about to say as criticism, but in many ways, the actions of the United States directly convinced the British that they needed full EEC membership to survive in the post-war world order. The failure of the United States to support the British invasion of the Suez Canal in 1956 led to a huge crisis of confidence in Britain, one that I would argue we never really fully recovered from until the Falklands War of 1982. The inability to suppress a relatively small Egyptian incursion and the failure to secure US support led to an admittance that Britain's role as the world's policeman was over and that the empire's time was up. It also led to a feeling that the United States was no longer a reliable ally. Consequently, in 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson accepted that a wind of change was blowing, particularly across Africa, resulting in what Churchill would come to call the scuttle from empire. As former US Secretary of State Dean Acheson said at the time, Britain was a nation that had lost an empire but had not yet found a role. To fill that role, however, Britain started to look towards continental Europe and began to turn its back on the rest of the world, including her own Commonwealth. Britain's insecurity on the global stage was also amplified by the fact that on her doorstep sat an aggressive and expansionist Soviet Union. It was blatantly obvious since the Suez debacle that she could no longer stand alone, as she had done against Germany in 1940. Fear of communism and Soviet designs ensured that Britain began to gravitate towards those who were geographically threatened by the Red Menace, and that meant closer ties with the continent. We must also consider the role that domestic politics played if we are to understand why Britain turned to Europe. Because whilst the Germans embarked on their economic miracle, aided by American money and a generous debt cancellation, Britain slumbered in a post-war comfort blanket of Keynesian rigidity. Indeed, both mainstream political parties practiced what became known as consensus politics, the consensus being primarily that the boat should not be rocked. Trade unions grew not only in size, but equally in influence and power. Industrial action was a regular occurrence. Inefficient state monopolies were the order of the day. Economic output fell, the pound was devalued, and a 3-day working week introduced. Indeed, by the 1970s, Britain was commonly known as the sick man of Europe. And Britain looked across the English Channel with envy at the perceived economic strength of her continental friends who seemed to be basking in the glow of economic stability. Now consider that Britain was in a state of shock by the 1970s. It was a nation in flux. She had won a war but lost an empire. She had witnessed those defeated or who she saved grow to be economic powerhouses while she was in economic decline. Alongside this, consider the threat posed by an aggressive Soviet Union sitting on Europe's doorstep, and I don't think it's too difficult to understand why the politicians of that period were so keen to throw their lot in with the rest of Western Europe. And who can blame the politicians who witnessed the horrors of the First and Second World Wars, wanting to secure a lasting peace in Europe? That is why I try to avoid judging the actions of those of the past by what we know now today. In 1972, Britain's application to join the EEC, or the European Economic Community, was accepted at the third time of asking. Prime Minister Edward Heath said on that occasion that Britain joining the EEC, and I quote, represented a beginning of another stage in the construction of a new and greater Europe. This is the task of our generation in Europe. Britain joined the original 6 members, Germany, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium and Italy, alongside Ireland and Denmark. Greece, Spain and Portugal would join this club in the following decade. In 1974, Heath's government, Conservative government, lost the general election and were replaced by Harold Wilson's Labour Party, which was committed, like Cameron now, to holding a referendum as to whether we should stay in the EEC. As is happening today, politicians, both left and right, put themselves into yes and no camps, respectively. The yes camp brushed aside any suggestions that a pooling of democracy or sovereignty, as though it was some sort of conspiracy theory from those not just on the peripheries of politics, but those on the fringes of sanity. The yes camp, which was fronted by Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, and indeed the former Prime Minister Edward Heath, informed the British people, and I quote, "The Minister representing Britain can veto any proposal for a new law or a new tax if he considers it to be against British interests, and that all other countries in the market enjoy, like us, democratically elected governments answerable to their own parliaments and their own voters. They do not want to weaken their parliaments any more than we would." They argued that our continued membership of the EEC was about jobs and trade and little else. The no side, represented by those on the right and left of British politics, warned of a lack of sovereignty and a democratic deficit. They painted a picture of the countries of Europe being welded together into a single nation that will take us, that will, and I quote again, will take away from us the right to rule ourselves, which we have enjoyed for centuries. These were indeed extravagant claims to make at the time, considering that the UK had only been a member of the EEC for just over 2 years. However, as I will show later, they were prophetic words indeed. In the end, the British people voted to stay inside the EEC by 67% to 33% against. However, there have been accusations ever since regarding the fairness of the referendum, such as the fact that the Yes campaign, which was funded by the British government, the European Commission, the banks, big business, were allowed to outspend the No campaign many times over. Indeed, John Mills, the national agent of the No campaign, recalled, and I quote, "We were operating on a shoestring compared to the Rolls-Royce operation on the other side." Moreover, the feeling that the British people were not told the truth in 1975 has festered until this day and has been the primary driver in both the creation and success of the UK Independence Party and calls for another referendum. Now let us move on and look at why the British people felt cheated in 75 and discuss the relationship the European institutions have with nation states. Firstly, people feel that they were not told the truth because what has been said and happened since. Indeed, the proof was there all along. One of the founders of the European project, Jean Monnet, said, and I quote in 1952, "The fusion of economic functions would compel nations to fuse their sovereignty into that of a single European state." This is precisely what the No camp was saying in 1975, yet their claims were countered by the Yes campaign to be outlandish and conspiratorial. Moreover, in later years, leading politicians of the day as good as admitted that they had been economical with the truth. For example, when asked in 1980 whether he had in mind a United States of Europe when Britain joined the EEC in 1972, Edward Heath responded, "Of course, yes." In the decades following that referendum, the European institutions have chipped away at the sovereignty of the nation state. Rather than blatantly bulldoze, they have preferred to disguise the transfer of power through a series of economic agreements. First came the Single European Act of 1986, which created the single market. Next followed the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, which in effect was preparation for monetary union and led to all EU members except the UK and Denmark entering the euro on the 1st of January 1999, with the notes coming into circulation in 2002. The European community also became the European Union, something that the British people had never signed up to. Next came the Treaty of Amsterdam and then Nice, which basically prepared the institutions of the European Union for enlargement. And in 2004, that enlargement came about as the EU was opened up to 8 former Eastern Bloc nations and also Cyprus and Malta. This has since placed a great strain on Western Europe, and particularly in Britain, as swathes of Eastern Europeans have used the EU's freedom of movement laws to come west. At this juncture, an arrogant EU overextended itself and in some ways allowed the mask that concealed its true ambitions to slip. As a nation needs a constitution, so did the European Union, if it was to achieve its goal of becoming a single state of Europe. Thus, the European Constitution was born. However, such a grand-sounding document pricked the ears of a sceptical public, and there were calls for referendums across the continent. Referendums in France, referendums in the Netherlands, both rejected the European Constitution, leaving the mandarins of Brussels to return to the drawing board, but not to be blown off its course of statehood. The EU contrived to bypass the people and push forward with its ambitions without the inconvenience of referendums or democracy. Therefore, the EU Constitution was rewritten, but instead called the Lisbon Treaty. In fact, the Lisbon Treaty is 94% identical to the EU Constitution. This treaty, in effect, moves the reality of the United States of Europe a step closer. The EU now has a High Representative, who is, in effect, an EU Foreign Minister, a diplomatic service, embassies, a flag, an anthem, and only 3 months ago, the current President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, called for the creation of an EU army because, and I quote, "Such an army would help us design a common foreign and security policy." In addition, last year, Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi stated that he would use the rotating Italian presidency of the European Council to promote a United States of Europe. However, many believe that this United States of Europe that the EU leaders are constructing will have more in common with the Soviet Union than the freedom-loving democratic United States of America. Indeed, the former General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, noted, "The most puzzling development in politics during the last decade is the apparent determination of Western European leaders to recreate the Soviet Union in Western Europe." In addition, bound up with the quest for the United States of Europe is an underlying anti-Americanism. An imperial thirst, ladies and gentlemen, for EU expansion is also omnipresent in the minds of Europe's leaders. Last year, British Prime Minister David Cameron spoke of a European Union that would stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Urals, and then we wonder why the Russians are so paranoid about the EU's ambitions. And even more enlightening were the words of former President of the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, who said when talking about the EU's ambition for Turkish entry, "Sometimes I like to compare the EU as a creation to the organisation of empire." We have the dimension of empire. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to quickly return to the beginning. As Joseph Chamberlain said in 1904, the day of small nations has passed away. The day of empires has come. 100 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, the old empires were the destroyers of the smaller nation states. Today, they have been replaced by supranational organisations that swallow up sovereignty and, like the old empires, have expansionist tendencies. As the words of the former European Commission President Barroso show, there is no better example in the world today than that of the European Union. The romantic British poet Lord Byron once wrote, "That history, with all her volumes vast, hath but one page." And I hope today that I have made it clear to you that the ambitions of men 100 years ago are still the ambitions of men today. And indeed, that the old empires of days gone by and the European Union are in effect on the same page of history. Or to use a more contemporary analogy, which is fitting here in the land of the movies, it's a case of Back to the Future. Thank you very much.
At this moment, I'll just make this time available for individuals to ask a few questions, and then right after that, I will introduce to you the Executive Director of the Institute for Direct Democracy in Europe. So if you could just kindly state your name and the organization that you're affiliated with, that'll be appreciated. So just a few questions, and if you could keep your questions very brief, that'd be great. The gentleman right in the back over there, and then we'll come to the gentleman in front.
I just want to try again to get slightly closer to these principles that you might use when thinking about the alternatives that Britain has to the European Union. Trade is not enough for a country like Britain. I work in international development. The things that Britain offers to many countries around the world with regard to running a democracy, running a legal system, running enormous amounts of good governance in its own country is enormous. We have relationships across the world. We offer military, geographic, lots of things to lots of countries. Trade is not enough for a country like Britain. It's why I, as a British Conservative, can't believe in you because you don't appear to take Britain as it currently stands seriously enough.
You do the trade bit. We'll get at this one.
Okay, all right.
So can I just come back with a response? You have given the best argument for Britain leaving the European Union. We have these relationships. We are part of, excuse me, I'm trying to give you your answer. We are part of major international organizations. We have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. We would be back in a full seat on the WTO. We are part of part of NATO. We are the leading country in the Commonwealth. We are one of the most globally connected countries in the world, and you appear, sir, to be suggesting to us that we can only exercise our place in the world through Europe. Our argument is the reverse. We have those connections. We are being held up in our contact with the rest of the world by being members of the European Union. William's already made the case on trade, but please.
I think I'd rather like the gentleman to come back. It's a very, very important point you're raising.
The EU is an alliance that we're in. Okay. The EU, we are in some sort of alliance with the EU, to which we wanted to contribute things like spreading democracy, human rights, particularly beyond the borders of the European Union eastwards, against one of our main intellectual opponents, which was the Soviet Union.
That's gone well, hasn't it?
I'll try and keep it short. It's an alliance. Britain has always had alliances.
Yeah.
Warm words about the United States and trade are not enough. What's the alternative alliance?
Okay.
What are we going to offer in that alliance, and what are we going to get out of it? Who's it going to be with?
Okay, first of all, it isn't an alliance. And unfortunately, it means that Roger, actually, except for Roger, I have utterly failed in my opening remarks because it isn't an alliance. It's a political union. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of it. That's what it is. If it wasn't an alliance, that would be fine. And we want to have an alliance. We want friendship and free trade and political alliances. But it isn't. It's a political union. Now, you talked about, and rightly so, sir, you talked about our existence, our influence in other parts of the world. The most obvious one is our permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Now, I said MEPs don't matter very much, and the European Parliament doesn't matter very much. But the UK's seat on the UN Security Council is under permanent attack from the European Commission and the European Parliament. The last resolution passed about a year ago, saying basically that neither Britain nor France should have its seats on the its permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The fact of the matter is that our membership of the European Union means, which isn't an alliance, it's a political union. It's meant to be a United States of Europe. It makes us one of 28. Now, again, it was all very boring, but it doesn't make it untrue. We have 8.24% of our votes in the Council of our ministers. We are in our own right, for the moment, members of over 100 important international organisations which codify the law of the sea and all the rest of it. Now, already our seat on the World Trade Organization, arguably the most important, or perhaps the second most important, we don't have that. It's in abeyance. The moment we leave, we can sit and take our seat along with the United States and Belize and so on. I mean, with respect, sir, first of all, I have utterly failed in my opening remarks, is that it isn't an alliance. It is a political union. It's a political union where our influence in the world is systematically diminished. And that is the point. That is the point I'm trying to convey, and that is the point which I perhaps can leave you to consider.
The gentleman right over here to my right.
But great question.
Thank you. I'm Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. And another trade question, but I think along the same lines, I think, but more specific. What is your prognosis for the agreement on the transatlantic trade agreement? And could it have been done, or could it be done once once the UK leaves the European Union? A U.S. U.K. trade agreement.
Well, first of all, and this slightly derives from what I was saying earlier on, it's just technically more difficult to come to an agreement when it's more difficult for 28 countries to come to a trade agreement than it is for one country. I mean, for example, entirely separate example, we in the UK don't have much of a textiles industry. However, there are substantial textile industries in Spain, Italy, and to a lesser extent Portugal. So it just makes sense. That's a whole other thing that has to be brought in. It's just more difficult. Now, the other thing that happens with EU trade agreements is there is what I've called over the years, although no one's ever picked it up very much, I have to say, the politicization of trade. Now, just yesterday, Commissioner Malmström said to the Trade Committee in her speech, which would have been written for her, modernising trade policy, the Commissioner said, we need to do more to promote EU values around the world through trade. So trade agreements are used, have been used, will be used, and that is EU policy, as a way of promoting EU policy, foreign policy goals, which you may or may not agree with, that isn't the issue, but it just makes it more difficult. And so we will be better off in terms of just trade agreements, and trade is much more about trade agreements, and politics is about more than just trade agreements. But in terms of negotiating and entering into trade agreements and having trade agreements, we will be more able to do so, more likely to be able to do so outside the EU rather than in it. And I think the slide that I produced on Switzerland was really quite telling in that context.
If I can just make a quick observation, my own view is there probably would have been a U.S.-UK free trade agreement decades ago were we not members of the EU.
Right, we'll take this final question for the gentleman in the front, and then I will introduce the Executive Director of IDDE. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I already introduced myself earlier. I'm Michael Shaw. I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm interning this summer in the Senate with Senator John McCain. Firstly, my point is just a comment more than anything. As the gentleman at the back correctly identified, whilst I will be campaigning for a Brexit and a British people to leave the European Union, we do need to articulate what exactly Britain will look like in the future, because I don't want to go around knocking doors and campaigning for us to leave the European Union and not be able to turn around and say what exactly it's going to look like. Yes, there's the many points. Oh, we're going to be freed from the shackles. We're going to be able to go and negotiate our own terms with other countries. But I would like to see you guys, as the leaders of the campaign to leave the European Union, come up with some solid information as to what Britain's going to look like. But that's just a comment. My actual question is more to Roger Helmer, in particular with regards to the environment and energy. I mean, generally, people under 50, what you said about the environment doesn't go down well. I mean, you're not worried you're on the wrong side of the conversation. I mean, fair enough, climate change mightn't be as impacted upon wholly by man-made causes. But regardless of that, surely that we want to move away from a dependency on fossil fuels and move towards a cleaner environment, not just in terms of carbon emissions, but in terms of carcinogenic emissions and other things which are bad to public health.
Yeah, let me be clear. First of all, you mentioned younger people. I often speak to quite young people because I get invited to speak to schools. And a point that I always make if I've got a class of kids of 17 and 18 years old, I say, do you know that there has been no global warming in your lifetime? Because as I'm sure you're aware, we've now been about 18 and a half years with no further global warming. One of the problems, of course, is the enormous weight of propaganda for the global warming position in schools. No, I don't think we're on the wrong side of the debate. I think we're on the right side of the debate. Clearly, the momentum of global warming has stopped. We've seen all those predictions of the way global temperatures were going to go, predictions made 20 years ago. They are all wrong. They all grossly overestimated. None of them predicted that it would go flat. But we could debate the climate change issue for a long time. And we don't really have time to do that. What I'd like to come to is your point. Let's distinguish between, on the one hand, the environment and pollutants, and on the other hand, CO2. And one of the great problems in America today is that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the EPA has declared that CO2 is a pollutant. No, it isn't. It is a non-toxic, invisible trace gas that is essential to life on Earth, and if it weren't there, we'd all be dead. So it's important to get that in perspective. We are not arguing for a dirty environment. We believe that fossil fuels should be burned in an efficient way, and it is now possible to construct a coal-fired power station where the emissions are minimized. Obviously, the CO2 is there, and we would not support carbon capture and storage because we don't think it's necessary. It's merely a waste of money. We are in favor of clean technology for burning fossil fuels, but that doesn't mean that we would be in favor of controlling CO2. So I feel very strongly that we are on the right track there, and history will show, and that this long continuation of effectively zero global warming, I think, helps to make the case. Also, you've got to see it in context, that the changes we've seen in global temperatures over the last 150 years are entirely consistent with long-term natural climate change. If I can just pick up your first point, what do we say? What other position will Britain have when we're out of the EU? What is your alternative? And this is the question we've been hearing. People have put it to me, they said, well, if you don't want to be part of the European Union, do you want to be the 51st state of the United States of America? No, we don't. We want to be an independent country. The world is full of independent countries. We have been historically, and I believe should continue to be, a great global trading nation. We will be more prosperous as a great global trading nation than as an offshore province in a country called Europe. We don't have to have an alternative in the sense of saying, this is the new group we're going to join. We will have trading relationships and alliances around the world, especially with the Anglosphere, especially with the Commonwealth, but with all countries of goodwill around the world. As far as I'm concerned, if the European Union were a free trade area, I would be one of its greatest supporters. But I would like to see free trade extended globally beyond the European Union. But the question, what else will we be if we're not members of the European Union, implies that there is some obligation to be a member of something. No, there isn't.
Well, that goes back right to the 1975 referendum that I was speaking about. You know, the fear factor within the Yes campaign. You know, we're not Britain of the 1970s. We're not the sick man of Europe. We're the fifth largest economy in the world. We don't have, well, I certainly don't have post-imperial guilt like the politicians of the 70s had. We've got the Commonwealth out there. It covers a quarter of the globe, a quarter of the world's peoples, 20% of global trade. We share common law, we share language. It has some of the most stable economies on the planet, like Australia and Canada. Some of the fastest growing, like India, which is projected to be the largest economy on the planet by 2050. These are our friends. These are the people we should be trading with. These are the links that we should have in the 21st century. And, you know, it's a great country, Britain. And I will not have in this referendum campaign the inside basically scaring people to death with what if. We've got friends all over the globe and we should be using them.
Gentlemen, we thank you so much for being here at the Heritage Foundation this afternoon, and also your comments and remarks, and as well as your clearly articulated vision is certainly most appreciated. So please join me in thanking our distinguished speakers for that. At this moment, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who will also introduce colleagues of hers as well. And in fact, we will be serving lunch at 12:30, and then you'll have an opportunity to certainly meet up with these distinguished leaders from Europe. Laura Ferrari was an entrepreneur before she got into politics and a candidate to the last European elections in France. She's also the spokesperson on European affairs for France and a Eurosceptic Gaullist party. She is now the director of the Institute for Direct Democracy in Europe that she founded early this year. It's been a delight to work with Laura and her team members over the past year on a number of issues and projects, and it's a great delight to welcome Laura Ferrari to the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed to all of you, to the Heritage Foundation, for welcoming us today. It's been an honor. Thank you to Joel and Natasha, who have been working so hard for the last 2 months organizing this conference. I hope nobody in this room will take exception to the view that today in the modern industrial democracies, our electoral system is not delivering what people want, or indeed what they are entitled to expect in a modern, advanced world. The state now takes a far more active role in every aspect of our lives, for better or for worse, but I'm pretty sure that many people outside DC would say for worse. The governments we elect never seem to reflect what we want, and the result is often more lobby or non-party political pressure groups. This is dangerous for our societies. It's dangerous because it divides people into two camps. On one side, you have the activists with little or no accountability, and on the other side, you have apathists. The Institute for Direct Democracy in Europe, which I represent today, has been specifically brought into existence to investigate its way of bringing back the concept of government for the people, by the people. It doesn't pretend to have the answers, but to focus on the right questions. So we are here today to learn from your experience, to share your expertise, and we welcome any kind of support on your behalf. If you need me, I will be there afterwards. I can also deliver business cards. I hope you enjoyed the following presentations by our member of the Institute for Direct Democracy today, and I hope that you will understand what we are standing for. And if you still don't understand what we're standing for, I invite you to have a little chat with me at the reception organized by the Heritage Foundation for me to explain furthermore, to give you furthermore details. But I would like now to introduce my dear colleague, Yasmin Dehan, who is the Director for the Alliance of Direct Democracy in Europe. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, Alliance for Direct Democracy in Europe is an alliance, as its name says, of various European parties. Our member parties stand for national sovereignty, individual freedom and responsibility, tax limitations, public spending cuts, direct democracy by way of referendum, limiting immigration and fighting radical Islam. We dare to say that we are the voice of ordinary people, people that create wealth by their daily work and endeavors. In fact, we are the voice of common sense, both in our respective countries as well as in Brussels. To say the least, Brussels institutions have never been so distant from the people that they pretend to represent and serve. Our fight is not an easy one. Political correctness, the unwillingness to express harsh realities, is reigning in the press and traditional power circles. ADD allows us to join, share ideas, laugh and cry together, develop common approaches and projects. We realize often how much we are close to each other. Proud nationals, we are also true Europeans in the respect of our differences. I am happy today because I know that we are here between friends. Friends active across the ocean, but standing for the same values. We lead the same combat, Americans need Europeans. We need each other because our common values are today at stake. I have the privilege to introduce our leading members of the ADDE. First of all, Michael Modrikamen is one of the best-known lawyers in Belgium. He handled personally a large number of landmark cases that defined Belgium these last 25 years. But he put aside his legal career to serve the public good. In November 2009, he founded the Parti Populaire that he shares today. Michael is vice president of the ADDE and stands for all the values that I have listed previously. And from the white knight of the law, he became quite instantly the dark horse of politics. Largely boycotted by leftist media, he founded his own internet daily, Le Peuple. Next to him, we have Peter Lundgren from the Swedish Democrats. Peter is vice president of the IDDE. Peter is 52 years old, and he was for more than 30 years a truck driver. He went into politics 5 years ago and was in 2014 elected as a member of the European Parliament. Peter is a very humble man and an example of personal accomplishment by hard work and responsibility. He is the best example of how civil society can regenerate politics. Peter Mark, born in 1975 in Prague, he is a Czech economist and politician. In 2014, he was elected member of the European Parliament as the leader of the Free Citizens Party, a libertarian conservative party. Peter Mark earned his PhD from the University of Economics in Prague. Since 1998, he is a publisher of the Laissez-faire newsletter. Peter Mark worked as an advisor to the former president of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, with whom he shares enthusiasm for the free market economy and Euroscepticism.
Mesdames, Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, I read in the presentation sheet this morning that we are the bonus speaker. So after Nigel and our UKIP colleagues, you will have right to the Flemish accent, French-speaking accent, Swedish accent, Czech accent, so a bit of Europe. It's an honor for me to take the floor first time at the Heritage Foundation here, which I believe defends the core values of this great republic. Ladies and gentlemen, I come myself from a tiny country, Belgium, and I am citizen in Belgium of the smallest part of it, French-speaking Wallonia and Brussels, 4.5 million inhabitants, nothing. But Brussels, ladies and gentlemen, is the capital of Europe, and Wallonia is at the crossroads of the main nation of Europe, Germany, UK, France, the Netherlands. Belgium in the past has been very inspired, and we have been playing role model for others. Our constitution of 1830 was copied many times all over the world as a model. Wallonia, at the end of the 19th century, I will remind you that, was the second economic power in the world after the UK, second economic power in the world. And tiny Belgium, which I represent today, was an example of courage and heroism facing the brutality of German invaders during World War I. At that time, I will also remind it to you, the American people, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, literally fed the Belgian population during that dark period. Literally brought food to the Belgian population. And you, your parents, your grandparents, came again to free us from Nazi Germany, from Nazi tyranny in 1944, and afterwards helped us rebuild our devastated economies. We will never forget. I will never forget. The Belgian population will never forget. But ladies and gentlemen, today, Belgium, Wallonia particularly, and Brussels are again in a dire situation. And I'm sure you don't know about it. First of all, taxes. Taxes absorbs 60% of our GNP, second highest in the world, 60% of our GNP. Cost of labor. For any employees receiving $2,000 net in its pocket, it costs today $5,000 to the employer in Belgium. For $2,000 net, $5,000 of gross cost. This explains why one Walloon and Brussels citizen out of 4 today is now a job seeker. 25% of the population in Wallonia and Brussels in the age of working is now seeking a job at the center of Europe. Our justice system, Yasmin told you I'm a lawyer for 25 years, our justice system is collapsing. We render justice as we did in the 19th century. We didn't adapt. Public security is not guaranteed anymore. Firm prison terms under 3 years are not enforced anymore. If you get 3 years, under 3 years prison jail today in Belgium, you don't go to jail anymore, which create a total feeling of impunity. And this because we lack place in our derelict jails, in the center of Europe, in Brussels, capital of Europe. In Wallonia, French-speaking part, we are second to last in terms of educational PISA test, international test, second to last, although we invest a lot of money in education. And this is due to the egalitarian culture where individual efforts are not anymore valued and encouraged. Mass immigration of unqualified, unskilled people that do not speak our language, that do not share our values, comes in Belgium to take advantage of a very generous social system, which is on the other way bankrupt. People come to settle in Belgium and are immediately entitled with all social security benefits, immediately. If you were a job seeker in Morocco and get entitled social security for it, you come to Belgium, you get it immediately. No delay. No enticement to work at all. And ladies and gentlemen, within 20 years, according to very serious demographic studies, Brussels, the capital of Belgium, but also the capital of Europe, will have a Muslim population majority within 20 years. As of today, it's between around 35% of the population in Brussels. And the main problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that according to several polls conducted in Europe and in Belgium, more than half of our Muslim population declare themselves to share radical Islamic values and strong anti-Semitic feelings and prejudice. More than half of our Muslim population. And in 20 years, we will have a Muslim majority in the capital of Europe. And this situation aggravates with the second and third generation. We had not problem with the first generation, mainly. But things becomes worse with the second and third generation. We are pedaling backward. This is not all. We have in Belgium, listen, the highest rate per Muslim capita in all Europe that joined to fight with ISIS. Highest rate per capita, per Muslim capita in Belgium, in all Europe, joined ISIS. We have approximately 500 fighters, terrorists, that went there to commit crimes and horrible things. Listen now, according to a study of University of Milano that was issued 2 months or 3 months ago, 40% of all messages posted on Facebook in Arabic language. In Belgium, 40% of all messages are in support of ISIS, of the Islamic State. 40% of the messages posted in Arabic from Belgium. And ladies and gentlemen, Jewish population, is leaving Belgium. Not a good sign for our society, because anti-Semitism and Jews' hatred are the first sign of something much deeper. In fact, the Jews play the same role than the canary birds in the mines, whose death was a clear indicator of the incoming life threat for the miners. And Jews are leaving massively Belgium. And finally, Belgium is also abandoning one after the other its Judeo-Christian founding values. Let me give you an example. We have a very liberal euthanasia law, the right legally to kill people. Old people, children, prison inmates, or even young depressed women who tend to suffer because of their depression can now claim for death through medical assistance. All this in Belgium. Enough. As Yasmin said, I decided to act. I deliberately put aside my successful legal career to launch a new political movement in Belgium, the Parti Populaire, the party of the people. We want to reach out to the people. And of course, our objectives are we want to reduce tax and public spending, control immigration, fight Islamism, restore security for citizens. We promote individual responsibility. We are climate change skeptics. We are Atlanticists, pro-Israel. We favor referendum. And we vigorously denounce rampant anti-Semitism. It sounds familiar to you. But as a consequence of this position in Belgium, in my country, I am totally ignored by the media, not to say boycott. Although we get 6% at the last election, and MPs. We hold press conference, and the press do not come. We are not invited to the debate. We are not, to the eyes of many leftist journalists, which are the majority of all the journalists, we are not part of the reasonable scope of ideas. Give you an example. I wasn't, as president of the party, not invited on the main commercial TV, RTL, main commercial TV in Belgium, RTL, since 2010, 5 years. I am invited once a year on the public channel, approximately once a year, and this with 6% of the vote. We know that the public is waiting for our message, and the press and the establishment decided to try a wall, to build a wall, a dam, between our message and the message of the citizen. That's why we decided to launch, as Yasmin said, our own media, Le Peuple, to reach out to the people through social media. We want, and I will quote, to Uberize the press. Like Uber is replacing the taxi, we want also to circumvene the press and bring our message straight to the people. Because, and I will conclude on this because they tell me that time is running short, I would have a lot of things to tell you yet, but still one important message today to you, to this distinguished audience. We have to succeed also in Europe, because the question for you here is, and for us, can we afford to definitively lose Brussels and Belgium, the political center of Western Europe, to the leftists and their Islamo-fascist allies? This is the question. Can we afford to lose Brussels? Our fight there should be your fight. As your fight here, as conservative movement, as conservative think tank, for the soul of this great nation, is also our fight. I consider it that way too. We are, ladies and gentlemen, on the same boat. Our value in Europe and here in the States are threatened by the current European, but also the current US leadership. Let me give you an example. I will be more straightforward than Nigel in his speech. The Iran deal just signed will, to my eyes, remain an infamy in our history. Our shameful leaders here in the States and in Europe did obviously not learn anything from the Munich experience. But tomorrow, the Iranian threat will be nuclear, much more devastating than the Nazi menace. And here's my message to you. I know that your Congress can still stop it if it gains the 3/4 majority. And I know that there are members or associate members of the Congress in this room. And as a European, I know this is the last break we can apply. I beg you to do so for us and for our children. Friends, we have to join forces because our struggle is global and we have first to rearm morally. Let us unite in this sacred call. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm not a big fan of pre-written speech, so I will shoot from the hip, as they say in America. My name is Peter Landgren. I come from Sweden. As you heard, I've been a truck driver 30 years before coming into the politics. And I mainly got into the politics because I was quite fed up with the situation that was going on in Sweden. And I went into the party of the Sweden Democrats and found myself on the election campaign for the European Union and also got elected. Came into the European Union. I tell you, that's quite a different world than being a truck driver. Not only with the suits, but even the system. It's built up to, it's like the upper class and the lower class. If you have, like I have, the badge, people, they will bow to you. They will open the doors. You have separate entrances as an MEP, member of European Parliament, and the staff. Of course, where I go in, or where they want me to go in, there's a nice carpet. So I always use the staff entrance. Feels quite stupid for me to have a separate entrance. Also, buying coffee, for example, you have the special lines for the MEPs, and I hate it. They asked me in a television interview that was broadcast home in Sweden what I thought about the European Union after being there for 6 months. And I said, well, it reminds me about the very early society in America, where black and white people were not allowed to travel in the same bus. It's pretty much the same in the European Union. You have the MEPs as an upper class, and you have the ordinary people like the lower class. And that fills me with anger, that we actually have a system like that still today. And you know what happened? 6 months I was there, trying to do my job the best I could. There was a lot to learn, of course, coming in as a former truck driver. But I picked it up, and the group assigned me to being a coordinator in the Transport Committee. And that is, of course, a favorite subject for me, since working in the area for 30 years. Then I soon found out that there's a lot of people that more or less have studied their common sense away totally. They don't know shit, to be honest, about how it works in common life. That is the thing. So it's quite fun sometimes to tell them, when they have studied all the reports and all the comments from the experts, and you can tell them, don't you understand, this doesn't work in a practical life. And then they are looking at you as you are some stranger from the planet of Mars or something. And you have to explain, like to a little kid, this is not working because of this and this. So you know what they did? After 6 months, they nominated me to the MEP Award Prize. That is for the members of the parliament that has done an outstandingly good achievement in their committee. They wanted to give me a prize for doing the job I was elected for. It's amazing. So I went to the final and I became second, luckily. Because being a member of a Eurosceptical group, it would feel quite strange, actually, to be awarded by the system I'm trying to fight. So luckily, I just became second. But it's a struggle, actually, because what they are doing in European Union, they are taking small decisions all the time that leads to quite big steps in the end. And you try to fight it all the way, and you have people that talk against you, and well, that's not so bad. We take a decision of this little bit. Yeah, but you have to see it in the complete picture. When the complete picture is done, they have built the United States of Europe. That is their goal. And I'm really trying to fight it the best way possible. And for that, of course, we are not very popular. Whenever we are trying to give our speeches about how things is working down there, they are standing there booing, of course, because they are not used to hear the ordinary people's voice, I would say. So for me, it's quite, as I said, fun to go up there and give them the ordinary people's view of things. That was the election campaign my party did as well in Sweden. The slogan was, we are sending ordinary people to Brussels. And I say it's needed. We need to send more ordinary people, more common people to Brussels, because that house is so crowded with legal advisors, with people who spent entire life in universities and don't have any practical input from life. They don't know how the decisions they take actually affects the man on the street. And that is a huge problem. I can see it in my own country. We have it like that, of course, the European legislation overrules the national legislation, if it's in the same area. That means in Sweden, European Union is deciding over 60% of the national legislation in Sweden. And we are, of course, with our hands tied on the back. We can't make our own trade agreements, of course. We are not even allowed to speak about that with other countries. I would say that the European Union is the worst thing ever, because we can't, as a sovereign state, negotiate for any trade agreements with countries that European Union they don't want to negotiate with. And the problem is, when you do these trade agreements, it's 28 member states that wants to have their saying, what they want. So, you know, I don't feel I'm sitting there for fighting for the European Union. I'm sitting there fighting for my country, Sweden. That means I'm not sitting there to do the best deal possible for European Union. I'm sitting there to do the best deal possible for Sweden, my country. And that is a problem many politicians today, that they have forgot why they are sitting there. Because they are taken really well care of in that building. Huge payments, of course, huge benefits, and they very soon forget why they were elected. So for me, it feels really nice coming in as an ordinary working guy, be able to tell them my point of view. I even instructed the staff working for me, if you see me try to change into something I wasn't from the beginning, please hit me. So I wake up, because I don't ever want to be one of those bureaucrats that are sitting in that house in Brussels. So I will fight it all the way I can. I'm very happy to be a member of the EFDD group, where I have all of my friends share the same opinions. And it feels good to have the backup all the time from all my fellow colleagues here. And yeah, I don't know what more to say. I'm quite an ordinary guy, but I'm trying to fight the system as hard as I can. And I hope in next election, maybe I will have more people joining me from my party, because in Sweden we are growing rapidly, the Sweden Democrats. We are in the latest poll up to 22.1%. We are 2% behind the Liberals and the Socialists. And we have, the 3 latest elections, doubled our result. We went from 3% 2006. Then we went to 6% in 2010. Then we went to 12.9% to last year in September. And we estimate that within a couple of months, we will be the biggest party in Sweden. And we call us, by right, I would say, the only opposition party in Sweden, because we are speaking the voice of the ordinary people. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Peter Mach. I'm coming from the Czech Republic, from a country in the heart of Europe, and I want to assure that there are many lovers of freedom in my country. Myself, I have definitely been inspired by the Heritage Foundation and similar institutions established in the United States. For a long time, I have been a user, a reader of your publications, and only a few years ago, I would not even imagine that one day I would speak here, and I must say that it's a real privilege to me. And furthermore, I could not even imagine that I would be a politician, not even member of the European Parliament. So I would like to tell you briefly how it happened, and then I would like to share with you some political ideas and policies of my political party, Free Citizens Party, Strana svobodných občanů, in my language. I had always been a responsible voter. I have always been an advocate of freedom, of free trade, of small government, of low taxes, of low level of regulation, of the national sovereignty, of democracy with clear limits to the political power, to tax, to make debt, and so on. And for many years, I was able to choose among political parties in the Czech Republic. And there were parties which promised low taxes, stopping creating public debt, parties that were against giving more powers to Brussels unelected institutions. But the problem was that the reality was the opposite. One day I found that the political party I voted for, which was in favor of low taxes against giving more powers to Brussels, in reality gave more powers to Brussels, in reality increased taxes, and in reality it increased public debt. So what could I do as a responsible voter? I had no other option than to establish a new political party. So it happened 5 years ago, and a year ago I was elected member of the European Parliament, which means that we succeeded crossing the threshold of 5% of the vote which exists in the Czech Republic. So currently, I am happy that I am part of this group, which includes my predecessors here, including Nigel Farage, that there is this group of people of similar ideas. So let's share some of them. In the Czech Republic, we are not part of the Eurozone. We have our own currency, and its rate of inflation is 0 or between 0 and 1%. It's because our constitution in the Czech Republic says that the main goal of the national bank is to maintain price stability. Of course, that I am against joining the Eurozone, which does not mean that I am completely against the euro. Of course, that I have been always saying that the euro would be a disaster, and I am fighting against joining the euro. But I am also in favor of a currency competition. It's legal in the Czech Republic to use the euro, and many shops, supermarkets accept the euro from their customers. And I think that besides having clear limits in the constitution to maintain price stability, it's practical also to have a currency competition. I think that this kind of competition is the most important for keeping the inflation low. It's the best barrier against the abuse of political power in the monetary affairs. What about taxation? I have written many articles and studies on flat tax in the Czech Republic. But when I established the Free Citizens Party back in 2009, we already had an income tax with a flat rate. So instead of suggesting abolishing many of these allowances and deductibles, we came with an idea of abolishing completely this tax. In fact, in the Czech Republic, the individual income tax represents just 3%, about 3% of the of the gross national income. So our plan is to abolish most of the subsidies, and on the other hand, to abolish this tax completely. Also, of course, we loathe that it's the European Union which dictates many taxes, which says what tax should be on babies' diapers, for instance. So we also believe in tax competition. We believe that it's useful to have limits to the political power regarding taxes. And I admire Switzerland. In Switzerland, the constitution says what shall be the maximum rates of value-added tax, of income tax, and I would like to have something similar in the Czech Republic as well. But besides the constitution, the other important barrier against the abuse of the political power in the field of taxation is the tax competition. And that's the main reason why we prefer having independent, sovereign countries in Europe instead of one big superpower called the European Union. So, we are in favor of free trade, but still we are against the Czech Republic's membership in the European Union. So when I say that I am in favor of leaving the EU, it does not mean that we are that we are for isolation. In fact, we are in favor of free trade, and we have a role model for this in Europe. not all European countries are part of the European Union. There is another organization in Europe called European Free Trade Association, known under its acronym EFTA. It includes, right now, it includes just 4 countries: Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. But it's a role model because it has no bureaucracy. It does not need a common parliament. It does not distribute any subsidies to its members, which means that it does not collect contributions for this. It does not dictate taxes to its members. So we have this role model. Back in 2003, we had a referendum in the Czech Republic about joining the EU. I voted against, but most voters voted in favor. But now the situation is changing. Maybe that before we vote in favor of leaving, the European Union will simply split apart itself. And I am looking forward having again this dynamic environment of competing and neighboring and cooperating states of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your kind attention. We appreciate our friends at ADDE and IDDE for bringing many of our guests here with us today. We do have lunch available in the foyer, and you have plenty of time to talk with our guests there and ask specific questions about their efforts in Europe at that time. Thank you again for joining us here at Heritage.